The key card burns in my palm, stolen from my husband's pocket. His mother's voice echoes through the estate. Maya is sterling property. The rain hammers the windows like a countdown. I have one chance to reach the car before Julian realizes what I've taken. The door locks with a final click. Too late. The will wasn't just cruel, it was a trap. My own name on the documents, signing away my daughter's future. The key card buzzes in my grip, the only way out. But the halls are too quiet. They're already moving. And I'm holding the one thing they can't let me keep. The smell of old paper and lemon polish always made Sarah Miller's skin crawl. It was the scent of the Sterling Library, a room designed to make a person feel small, tucked away in the sprawling wings of a Connecticut estate that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. Sarah stood by the mahogany shelves, her fingers trembling as she smoothed out a piece of parchment she'd found tucked behind a leather-bound volume of tax law. The paper was heavy, cold to the touch, and bore the jagged, arrogant signature of Silas Sterling. As her eyes scanned the cramped lines of the hidden codicil, the air in the room seemed to thin. The document didn't speak of family or legacy in the way a normal will might. Instead, it used the language of a hostile takeover. It classified 8-month-old Maya not as a granddaughter or a human being, but as a primary corporate asset. The legal jargon was a thicket of thorns, but the meaning was sharp. Maya was a bridge, a bargaining chip designed to secure equity in Sterling Industries. Sarah's breath hitched, a ragged sound in the tomb-like silence of the library. She realized then that, to the people in this house, her daughter wasn't a baby to be loved. She was a stock option to be managed. The walls of the estate, once merely imposing, now felt like the bars of a very expensive cage. Sarah didn't wait to process the betrayal. She moved with the frantic, silent grace of a cornered animal. She snatched Maya from her crib in the nursery, the baby making that soft, rhythmic clicking sound with her tongue that meant she sensed her mother's soaring pulse. Outside, a summer storm had turned the manicured lawns into a swamp of gray mud and lashing rain. Sarah sprinted toward the perimeter, the grocery list in her pocket crinkling, a frantic paper heartbeat against her thigh. She reached the iron gates, her breath coming in raw gasps that tasted of ozone and wet pine. "Going somewhere, Sarah?" The voice was like a razor blade wrapped in silk. Julian stood by the gatehouse, his silhouette backlit by a flash of lightning. He didn't look like a husband. He looked like a debt collector. He stepped into the light of the security lamps, his expensive wool coat dark with rain, his platinum watch catching the rhythmic blue pulse of the gate's sensors. He explained it then, his voice a low, predatory drone, counting the reasons why she couldn't leave. He hadn't just known about the codicil. He had helped draft it. He needed Maya's trust fund to plug the holes in his own failing investments. To Julian, trading his daughter's freedom for a return to financial grace wasn't a sin. It was a strategic necessity. "Give her to me," Julian said, his voice devoid of heat. "It's a non-negotiable reality, Sarah. You're vibrating. It's distracting." He reached for Maya, his fingers long and pale. Sarah didn't think. She reacted. As Julian lunged, she pivoted, her shoulders slamming into his chest with the force of years of suppressed rage. They went down together in the slick mud. The air smelled of scorched earth and wet wool. In the chaos of the scuffle, Sarah's hand brushed against the hard plastic edge of the encrypted keycard in Julian's pocket. She swiped it with the practiced ease of a waitress snatching a tip off a moving tray. She scrambled back, her boots skidding on the gravel. But the victory was short-lived. The heavy iron gates didn't open. Instead, two burly men in charcoal suits, Eleanor's private security, emerged from the shadows of the oaks. Their hands were like iron clamps on her arms. They didn't hit her, but the way they hauled her back toward the house was more terrifying than a blow. It was a clinical, professional removal. Sarah managed to shove the stolen keycard deep into the lining of her boot, just as they dragged her across the threshold of the grand foyer, the heavy oak doors thudding shut with a sound like a gavel. They didn't take her to a bedroom. They took her to the library, where the air was thick with the scent of Eleanor's lavender floor wax and the stale smoke of a cigar. Eleanor Sterling sat behind the desk, her skin pulled tight over her bones, her eyes the color of frozen slush. Beside her stood a man Sarah recognized from the local news, Judge Thomas Brennan. He wasn't wearing his robes, but he held a fountain pen like a scepter. Eleanor didn't raise her voice. She spoke in soft, melodic tones that made the hair on Sarah's neck stand up. She informed Sarah that the instability she had shown tonight, running into a storm with an infant, was evidence of postpartum psychosis. The judge was there to sign an emergency order. Sarah had 6 hours. She could sign the documents voluntarily, granting full custody to the Sterling estate, or she would be moved to a private psychiatric facility in upstate New York. "The world is a predatory place, Sarah," Eleanor whispered, her voice a funeral dirge. "We are simply ensuring the asset remains in the right hands." The next few hours were a blur of psychological warfare. Eleanor didn't just threaten Sarah. She began to erase her. From the hallway, Sarah heard the rhythmic, mechanical whine of a paper shredder. She watched through the cracked door as Martha, the head housekeeper, began to feed Sarah's life into the machine. Her birth certificate, her old photos of her mother, the few records of her life before Julianne, all of it turned into gray confetti. Martha's face was a mask of institutionalized obedience. Every time she bumped into a piece of furniture while clearing Sarah's things, she whispered sorry to the wood. The house felt alive, a predatory entity that was slowly digesting Sarah's identity. The nursery, once a place of soft colors and stuffed animals, was being transformed. Men moved the furniture, installing a heavy deadbolt on the outside of the door and bars over the windows that overlooked the rose garden. Sarah felt the walls closing in, the cloying scent of lavender wax clogging her throat. She was no longer a guest or a daughter-in-law. She was a prisoner in a gilded cage, waiting for the clock to strike midnight. Desperation drove her to movement. While the guards were distracted by a shift change, Sarah slipped out of the library and moved toward the servants' wing. She remembered Bill, the groundskeeper, mentioning an old shortwave radio in the attic, a relic from the Cold War that Silas had kept just in case. She climbed the back stairs, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The attic was a graveyard of sterling history, smelling of dust and mothballs. She found the radio, its vacuum tubes glowing a faint, sickly orange. But before she could even touch the dial, a shadow fell across the floor. Mrs. Gable, the head housekeeper, stood in the doorway. She wasn't holding a tray. She was gripping a heavy brass fireplace poker. "You don't belong up here, dear," Mrs. Gable said, her voice trembling with a terrifying kind of politeness. The struggle was brief and violent. Mrs. Gable swung the poker, the metal whistling past Sarah's ear and shattering a ceramic vase into 1,000 white shards. Sarah lunged, her fingers catching the woman's wrist. They wrestled among the trunks of old clothes, the air thick with kicked-up dust that tasted like copper. Sarah felt a surge of raw, maternal strength. She shoved Mrs. Gable back, and the woman's head struck the edge of a heavy oak wardrobe. She slumped to the floor, unconscious. Sarah stood over her, chest heaving, her knuckles white. She didn't find a signal on the radio. The wires had been cut long ago. But as she turned to leave, her foot caught on a floorboard that sounded hollow. Underneath the wood lay a leather-bound ledger, its pages yellowed and brittle. Sarah flipped it open, expecting more family secrets. What she found was a map of a crumbling empire. The sterling fortune wasn't just in trouble, it was gone. The ledger detailed millions in offshore debts to creditors who didn't use lawyers to collect. Silas hadn't been protecting a legacy. He had been running a global shell game. Eleanor and Julian didn't want Maya for her pedigree. They needed her signature, or rather, the signature of her legal guardian, to trigger a massive continuity of lineage insurance payout that was the only thing keeping the creditors from the door. Maya wasn't an heir. She was a life raft for a sinking ship of thieves. Sarah knew then that she couldn't just hide. She had to break out. She crept down to the estate's 6-car garage, the stolen keycard hot against her skin. The air here smelled of gasoline and expensive leather. She found the reinforced SUV Julian favored, a tank of a vehicle that could surely ram through the perimeter gates. She crawled under the steering column, her fingers searching for the wires, her mind racing back to the summers she'd spent helping her uncle in his workshop. "I expected better of you, Sarah." Truly. Julian was leaning against the garage door, the light from the overhead fluorescents making his sharp features look like a death mask. He didn't wait for her to speak. He moved with a sudden, jerky violence, grabbing Sarah by the hair and dragging her away from the car. The fight in the garage was brutal. Julian wasn't a fighter, but he was desperate, and desperation lent him a frantic, clumsy power. He threw her against a rack of heavy steel tools, the sound of falling wrenches echoing like gunfire against the concrete floor. Sarah's vision blurred as her head hit the floor. But the sight of Maya's empty car seat in the back of the SUV sparked something fierce in her gut. She reached out, her fingers closing around a heavy tire iron. As Julian lunged again, his face twisted in a snarl of elitist rage. Sarah swung. The cold metal bit into Julian's shoulder with a sickening thud. He let out a choked cry, stumbling back into a shelf of oil cans that tumbled down, coating the floor in a slick black sheen. Sarah didn't stay to see him get up. She scrambled toward the side exit, her breath coming in ragged sobs. She ran. She ran through the rain, her boots splashing in the deep puddles of the driveway. Ahead, she saw the lights of a vehicle, the rhythmic, pulsing glow of a cherry top. Subverted. Hope surged through Sarah like a physical electric shock. It was the local sheriff's cruiser, idling just outside the main gate. She knew Sheriff Miller, no relation, though he'd often joked about it at the diner where she used to work. He was a man of the law, a man who had sat at her counter and tipped well, a man who represented the world outside this nightmare. "Sheriff!" she screamed, her voice cracking against the wind. "Sheriff, help me. They've got my daughter. They're trying to lock me away." The cruiser's door opened, and Sheriff Miller stepped out. He looked exactly as he always did, heavy-set, his uniform a bit too tight, his face a map of weary authority. He held up a hand, signaling her to slow down. Sarah practically collapsed against the hood of the car, the heat from the engine warming her soaked jeans. "Slow down, Sarah girl," the sheriff said, his voice a calm, paternal rumble. "You're talking a mile a minute. Just breathe. You're safe now." Sarah felt the tension drain out of her so fast, her knees nearly buckled. She reached out, clutching his arm, her fingers digging into the fabric of his sleeve. "Julian. Eleanor. They have a judge in there. They're forging papers. They've turned the nursery into a cell. You have to get Maya. Please, you have to get her out of there." The sheriff nodded, his expression sympathetic. He reached into his belt boot and pulled out a radio. "I hear you, Sarah. I really do. It sounds like a nightmare." He clicked the radio. "I have the subject. We're coming in through the north entrance. Have the tea ready." The world tilted. Sarah froze, her hand still on his arm. "What? What did you just say?" The sheriff's face didn't change, but the warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced by a dull, transactional coldness. He didn't look at her. He looked over her shoulder at the mansion. "Eleanor Sterling bought my first patrol car, Sarah. She paid for my daughter's wedding. She's the reason this town has a paved main street." Before Sarah could pull away, his hand clamped around her wrist with the force of a bear trap. He didn't use the gentle grip of a rescuer. He twisted her arm behind her back, the bone groaning under the pressure. The click of the handcuffs was the loudest sound she had ever heard, a sharp, metallic finality that echoed in the rainy night. "You're not well, Sarah," the sheriff murmured, leaning close enough that she could smell the peppermint on his breath. "Running out here in the dark, attacking your husband with a tire iron? That's not the Sarah I know. That's a woman who needs medical supervision." He shoved her into the back of the cruiser. The seat was cold vinyl, smelling of stale coffee and old cigarettes. Sarah watched through the reinforced glass as the gates of the estate opened. Not to let her out, but to welcome her back as a prisoner. She had reached for the hand of justice and found it was just another Sterling asset. She was worse off than before. Now, her escape attempt would be the primary evidence used to prove she was a danger to herself and her child. The cruiser pulled up to the front steps. Eleanor was waiting under the portico, a silk umbrella held over her head by a silent footman. She looked down at Sarah through the window, a faint, pitying smile touching her lips. "Bring her into the study, Robert," Eleanor said. "The judge is getting impatient." Sarah was hauled into the house, her feet dragging on the expensive rugs. They took her to Silas's study, the inner sanctum. The room smelled of cedar and old money. Judge Brennan was sitting by the fire, humming a low, mournful funeral dirge as he reviewed a stack of papers. "You have 1 hour, Sarah," Eleanor said, pointing to the desk where a silver fountain pen lay waiting. "Sign the custody transfer and the insurance waiver. If you do, we'll ensure you have a very comfortable suite at the Weymouth Institute. If you don't, well, the sheriff here has a very detailed report about your violent outburst in the garage. You'll go to a state ward. You'll never see Maya again." Sarah looked at the clock on the mantel. The seconds were ticking away with a rhythmic, mocking click. She looked at her hands, bound in the heavy steel cuffs. She felt the crinkle of the grocery list in her pocket. Milk, eggs, bread. The simple things. The things that were real. "I need to use the restroom," Sarah croaked. Eleanor sighed, a long, weary sound. "Martha, take her. Keep the door open. You have 5 minutes." In the small, lavender-scented powder room, Sarah watched Martha stand guard by the door. But Martha was distracted, her eyes fixed on a smudge of mud Sarah had tracked onto the white tile. Martha stepped forward, pulling a rag from her apron to scrub at the spot, her lips moving in a silent apology to the floor. In that second of obsession, Sarah moved. She had spent years as a waitress, her fingers trained to be quick, to catch falling glasses, to palm change in a heartbeat. She reached for the desk set on the vanity, her cuffed hands moving in a blur. She swiped a long, sharp, decorative pin from a crystal holder, a gold-topped thing Eleanor used for her correspondence. Back in the study, Sarah sat in the heavy leather chair, her hands hidden beneath the table. She felt the pin in her fingers. She had watched a locksmith once, back at the diner, when he'd fixed the back door. She knew the mechanism of the old-fashioned cuffs the sheriff used. It wasn't about strength. It was about the click. Under the table, while Eleanor and the judge discussed the optics of the transfer, Sarah worked. The pin was thin, biting into her thumb, but she didn't flinch. Tick, tick, tick. The clock on the wall was the only sound. Then, a tiny, muffled snap. The left cuff loosened. She didn't pull it off. She kept her hands together, maintaining the facade of a broken woman. "Time is up, Sarah," Eleanor said, pushing the papers toward her. "Sign." Sarah picked up the pen. She looked at the signature line. Then she looked at the key card she had hidden in her boot, now pressed against her heel. She knew what she had to do. "I'm not signing," Sarah said. Before Eleanor could react, Sarah lunged. She didn't go for the door. She reached for the high-tech security panel beside the fireplace. She slammed the stolen keycard into the slot and punched the emergency override code she'd seen Julian use a dozen times. The reaction was instantaneous. A siren, shrill and deafening, tore through the silence of the mansion. From the ceiling, the fire suppression system erupted. It wasn't water. It was a thick, blinding chemical foam designed to smother flames in a library of priceless books. Within seconds, the room was a whiteout of stinging chemicals and shrieking noise. Sarah didn't hesitate. She threw off the cuffs and dived through the foam. She knew this room. She knew where Eleanor had been standing. She felt a silk sleeve, then the soft weight of a bundle. Maya, the baby, wasn't crying. She was making that 4-tap rhythm against Sarah's shoulder. Sarah tucked her under her coat and turned toward the bookshelves. Bill had told her once, while pruning the ivy, about the servant's breath. A hidden tunnel behind the history section used to move coal in the old days. She found the latch. The shelf swung open, and Sarah plunged into the dark, cool air of the service tunnel, just as the sheriff's heavy boots thudded into the foam behind her. The tunnel was narrow, smelling of damp earth and ancient soot. Sarah ran, her hands skimming the rough stone walls. But as she turned a corner near the basement cold storage units, her foot hit something soft. She clicked on her phone's flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on a long, silver-colored box, a medical-grade freezer. The lid was cracked open. Inside, preserved in a grotesque, icy stillness, was Silas Sterling. He hadn't died years ago. He hadn't died in his sleep. His skin was waxy, his scowl frozen in time. Beside him lay a stack of papers, forged death certificates, all dated within the last week. Eleanor hadn't just been hiding a debt. She'd been hiding a corpse to maintain her power of attorney. Sarah felt a wave of nausea, but she didn't stop. She took a photo, the blue light of the flash illuminating the patriarch's frozen face. Then she grabbed the ledger she'd tucked into her waistband and kept running. She emerged from the tunnel at the very edge of the property, where the woods met the highway. A delivery truck for a local bakery was idling on the shoulder, the driver checking his GPS. Sarah didn't ask. She climbed into the back among the smell of yeast and flour. "Drive," she rasped, showing the man the sheriff's badge she'd swiped during the scuffle in the foam. "Police emergency, just drive." 3 hours later, Sarah sat in a sterile, fluorescent-lit room in the federal building in downtown Hartford. She wasn't a waitress anymore. She wasn't a victim. She sat across from an investigator named James Peterson, a man who looked like he lived on black coffee and spite. She handed him the ledger. She showed him the photo of Silas. Subverted. Sarah watched Peterson's eyes widen. "This is it," he whispered. The offshore accounts, the forged signatures. This is a RICO case, Sarah. We can take down the whole Sterling operation. We can freeze every asset they have. Sarah felt a surge of triumph. This was the smart move. This was the way to ensure Eleanor and Julian could never touch her again. By burning the empire to the ground, she was building a wall around Maya that no lawyer could climb. "Do it," Sarah said. "Take it all." Peterson nodded and began barking orders into his phone. Within the hour, the news was a whirlwind of breaking banners. The Sterling name was being dragged through the mud. Federal agents were swarming the estate. But as Sarah sat in the waiting room, holding a sleeping Maya, the crack appeared. A young woman, no older than Sarah, sat down across from her, sobbing into her hands. She was wearing a uniform Sarah recognized, the housekeeping staff from the Sterling estate. "What happened?" Sarah asked softly. "They froze everything," the girl wailed. "The pension fund, the payroll. I have 3 kids, and my rent is due tomorrow. They told us the company is in receivership. There's no money left for the workers. It's all gone." Sarah felt a cold prickle of dread. She looked at Peterson as he walked back into the room, a smug smile on his face. "We got him, Sarah," he said. "The Sterling Empire is officially bankrupt. Not a dime left." "What about the trust?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "Maya's trust? The one Silas set up before the debts?" Peterson's smile faded. He looked down at his notes. "Sarah, that's the thing about a RICO seizure. When we freeze the assets of a corrupt organization, we freeze everything associated with the name. Because the original fortune was built on illegal offshore transfers, the court has ruled that all secondary trusts are fruit of the poisonous tree." The truth hit Sarah like a physical blow to the stomach. By providing the evidence that destroyed the Sterlings, she hadn't just secured her freedom. She had annihilated her daughter's future. The millions that were supposed to ensure Maya never had to struggle, the education fund, the security, it was all gone, seized by the government to pay back the very creditors and taxes the Sterlings had dodged. She had outsmarted the predators, but in doing so, she had scorched the earth they stood on. She was free, yes. But she was standing in the ashes of everything she had fought to protect. Maya didn't have a legacy anymore. She had a mother with a criminal record for assault and a suitcase full of shredded memories. The aftermath was a quiet, hollow kind of victory. 2 weeks later, Sarah stood in a small motel room in a town whose name she didn't bother to remember. The air smelled of cheap disinfectant and the faint, sweet scent of Maya's baby powder. Sarah stood before the cracked mirror, washing the last of the chemical foam residue from her hair. She looked at the bruises on her arms, yellow and purple flowers of the war she'd survived. She wasn't the woman who had walked into that estate a year ago. That woman was dead, buried under the weight of the Sterling name. She looked at Maya, who was sitting on the thin polyester bedspread, tapping her toy blocks in that rhythmic pattern of 4. Thump, 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 thump. "We're okay," Sarah whispered, though the room was empty. She realized then that her history as a waitress hadn't just given her quick fingers. It had given her the grit to know that you can lose everything and still find a way to make the next shift. She didn't have the Sterling millions, but she had the ledger of their sins, and she had the one thing Eleanor could never buy: the ability to walk down a street without looking over her shoulder. She spent the afternoon organizing the final documents for the federal prosecutors. She watched the news on the small, flickering television. Eleanor was in handcuffs. Julian was being led out of a courthouse, his expensive suit rumpled, his face a mask of pathetic, entitled shock. Sarah felt a flicker of the old anger, but she let it go. She watched Maya play, and she realized that revenge was a luxury she couldn't afford. Anger was a debt that only Sarah would have to pay. She chose, in that moment, to declare bankruptcy on her hate. The story didn't end with a mansion or a bank account. It ended in a sun-drenched public park 3 months later. The air smelled of cut grass and hot dogs. The messy, beautiful smells of a world that didn't care about the sterling name. Sarah sat on a bench, watching Maya crawl across the grass toward a dandelion. The baby's movements were free, unburdened by the weight of being an asset. She wasn't a bridge to a fortune or a piece of a merger. She was just a little girl with grass stains on her knees. Sarah reached out and took Maya's hand. The skin was soft, warm, and real. There were no bars here, no lavender wax, no synchronized clocks telling them they were in the wrong time zone. "Just us," Sarah murmured. She didn't have a plan for the next 10 years. She didn't have a trust fund. But as she watched the sun dip below the horizon, Sarah Miller finally felt the floor beneath her feet. It wasn't mahogany, and it wasn't marble. It was just the earth, solid and honest. And for the first time in her life, it was enough.